He sat at the window, looking out at the streetscape, but his eyes were blank and his thoughts were clouded. At the age of 48, he felt for the first time how hard it was to be an adult. So many years filled with fatigue, loss, and the hope that someday things would change. But none of his expectations had come true. Now his life has changed drastically. Everything he once thought was important had turned out to be worthless. He remembered how he used to be, ambitious and full of dreams. He was young, energetic and confident. And now? Things were different now. The main issue of his life had become caring for a woman he barely knew, his mother. The woman who had once been his support and strength, but was now becoming weak and helpless. Her name was Irina, and she was 75 years old. She sat in her chair by the window, immersed in the world of her memories, in which her mind wandered like a misty forest. Her hair used to be dark brown, but now it was gray and tangled, as if from time that had taken the light out of her life. The wise eyes, full of love and strength, were now only a reflection of her muddled thoughts. When she turned her head toward him, her gaze didn't immediately find his, and he wasn't sure if she understood him at all. "Mom, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice trembling, and he himself didn't know if it was a cry of desperation or just furtively held back irritation. She turned her head slowly, trying to focus on his face. She stared at him for a few seconds, then replied, You, my son." That answer was barely audible, like a faint whisper. Her eyes brightened for a moment, but as always, disappeared in a flash. "Yes, Mom, it's me. You remember, don't you?" he continued, raising his voice a little more, not hiding his annoyance. His mother smiled, and a flash of remembrance flashed across her face, scarred by the years. "Yes, of course I remember, my love." But there was no certainty in her eyes again, and she sank back into silence. His heart ached, and not just from those agonizing encounters. It ached from the fact that each day became like the one before, a day of caring for someone who barely remembered who he was, and who she was. With each passing year, his life turned into endless care and patience. It seemed that everything that had gone before in life was gone. Gone was the ambition, gone were the dreams. His mother, once a loving and strong woman, was now a shadow of herself. The woman who had saved him as a child now needed saving herself. Her illness, amnesia, had started 2 years ago, but to him it felt like an eternity. He felt that his own life had reached a dead end. He didn't know how to help her, how to regain what was lost. And with each passing day, he could feel it getting harder and harder for him. Although he never complained out loud, he knew he needed support himself. But every time he tried to share his feelings, he felt only emptiness in return. Then one day, in a burst of his dark thoughts, he realized that he couldn't go on living like this. He didn't want to be held hostage to this burden anymore. He didn't want to see this endless care ruin his life. And at some point, as he retired to his office again, going through old papers, the doorbell rang. It was Sylvia, the nurse who came to see them several times a week. She was patient and delicate, and there was always something native in her eyes, even if her face was tired. When he opened the door, her gaze was as it always was, calm, reserved. "How is she today?" she asked quietly. "The usual," he replied, feeling the fatigue pressing in on him. He tried to smile, but his smile wasn't genuine. Deep down he knew he couldn't go on like this any longer. Sylvia noticed his condition. "You need rest too, don't you?" she said, placing her hand on his shoulder. He only nodded in response. At that moment, however, dark thoughts had already begun to form in his mind, ones that he had long ago tried to keep out. He thought, what if he could get rid of this burden? What if his life could go back to normal again, if he could be free again? With each passing minute, his mind became more and more consumed by this thought. And the more he ran it through, the stronger it became. This thought could be a solution, albeit a terrible one. He didn't know at the time that this thought would lead to disastrous consequences. But for that moment, sitting in his chair and looking at his mother, he felt he had lost all hope. That evening, when he returned to his study, his thoughts were already full of determination. Sylvia had gone, leaving him alone with himself and his dark reflections. He could no longer go on living as he had before. All these years he had cared for a woman who barely remembered who he was and probably never knew that her love for him was anything more than maternal affection. At some point he had realized that all these years he hadn't lived for her, but for himself. And now that he found that he could be relieved of that burden, he couldn't let go of his hope for a better future. He sat in a darkened study, surrounded by old photographs and dusty papers, and tried to find some way out. Sometimes it seemed to him that it was in these old documents, in his father's things, that a clue was hidden. Maybe there was some sign there that would tell him what to do next. His fingers reached weakly for each of the folders, filling the room with nostalgia and pain. He opened an old desk drawer he hadn't touched in a long time. Inside were many forgotten things, old letters, bills, scattered papers. He went through them until his hand touched something unusual, an envelope, long since yellowed by time. He immediately noticed the notary's seal, familiar but foreign to him. Why hadn't he noticed it before? Why had his father never mentioned it? Without waiting for the envelope to be fully opened, he couldn't contain his greed. He tore open the paper and pulled out the letter. A letter written by his father a few months before his death. There was nothing joyful in his words. The letter began, "Dear son, there is something you should know about our legacy." He read on, with each word his heart began to beat faster, as if a fire bulb was igniting inside. His father wrote that there was a large fortune hidden in their family that had been carefully concealed all these years. His mother was the custodian of this secret wealth. The letter mentioned overseas accounts and real estate he never knew about. He felt his breathing becoming intermittent. But the worst part wasn't the information itself. It wasn't the money he'd never known. The scariest part was in that one sentence, "Your mother knows everything and is the only key to getting it. But she doesn't remember it." Those words wouldn't let him go. He realized that his life, everything he had done, all the sacrifice and agony, might be meaningless. It was becoming more and more obvious. He needed to find a way to take this fortune away. And while he already realized that his mother was in no position to help him, that her illness was destroying everything he had once known about her, he couldn't shake the thought that it didn't have to be this way. There was a path to freedom and money and independence that he could take. And maybe he wouldn't have needed to take that path if his mother hadn't become so helpless. But the moment he closed the letter and stood up to leave the study, his gaze fell on a photograph. In the picture was his mother, smiling, sitting with him on her lap when he was just a child. He remembered how she had cared for him, how she had always supported him, how she had been his defense. He felt again the affection and love he had once felt. And in that moment, something changed in his heart. But despite the memories, his thoughts returned to the letter. His father was right, his mother was the key to everything, and if she couldn't be fully conscious, how could he even claim this inheritance? Part 3, The Hero's Plan. The next morning he got up early and as he prepared breakfast for his mother, he began to think about his plan. He tried to be cautious, but as always his mind was ablaze with bright fire. He thought about how it would be easier to put it all behind him, leave this house and forget. But the thought of the inheritance and the fact that he could be free of all debts kept him in suspense. After breakfast, while his mother sat in her room, he went into the study and picked up the phone. He was booking a plane ticket. It was a ticket to a place where he could start his life all over again. Go to a place where nothing would bind him anymore. His mother wouldn't be able to follow him, she was too weak. And maybe it would be better to leave her here, where she would remember nothing. It was cruel, but in his eyes it seemed the only right thing to do. When he informed her that they were going on the trip, she smiled as always and agreed. It was an adventure for her, a new experience. She gladly accepted the offer and started packing, thinking it would just be a trip. He helped her, but inside his heart clenched at what he was planning. But thoughts of the future, of how he would be free of debt and worries, made him go forward again. His hands trembled, but he didn't give up. He took her hand, walked her to the cab and watched as she happily got into the car, not realizing that her life had just changed. It was sunny outside and he watched his mother, her smile and her perplexed eyes. He tried not to look at her face, not to show his pain, because he realized that by doing so he was killing her, killing their relationship. When they reached the airport, he felt a strange feeling. He couldn't explain why, but something in him was breaking. The airport, as always, was full of people. The hum of conversations, the sound of footsteps, the clinking of luggage carts, all of it merged into an indistinct mass of noise, as if reality itself became a blur. He stood on the threshold of a new stage of his life, clutching the handle of his suitcase in his hands, trying not to give away his inner excitement. The inner tension grew with every step, and despite all his determination, he felt a chill run through him. This was the moment when there was no turning back. Everything he had planned had to be done. He looked around, watching every movement. He realized that if his mother sensed anything strange, if she suspected his intentions for even a moment, everything would come crashing down. And his doubts, which had plagued him from the beginning, made his heart beat faster and faster. But he knew that if he stopped now, if he let the situation go, he would never be able to justify himself to himself again. Mother was happy as ever. She didn't realize that her fate was sealed, that her life would never be the same again. Every step, every word spoken to her only confirmed that she was believing a falsehood. All she thought was that she was just going on a journey with her son. A quiet, innocent joy of anticipation for a change she couldn't comprehend. As they approached the check-in desk, he felt his hands become wet with sweat. He handed over their passports and tickets, and the girl behind the counter smiled at them as if nothing was happening, as if it was just a normal day at the airport. He even managed to smile back, but only because his face was as tense as a taut rope. She checked their IDs and handed them their boarding passes. Everything was like a blur, he couldn't take in the whole of what was happening. Only one return ticket? The girl asked with slight bewilderment. His heart sank again. Yes, it just so happened, he replied, trying to keep his composure. She paid no attention to his nervousness, and continued her work without asking any more questions. They walked towards the gate, and he felt his chest tighten with guilt. He knew he wouldn't be able to stay calm for long. Looking at his mother, at her endless trust, he found himself sinking deeper and deeper into the chaos of his thoughts. Sometimes he wished he could just go to her, tell her everything and apologize. But he realized that was no longer possible. He couldn't turn back anymore, there was too much at stake. His life, his freedom, his hope for the future depended on what he would do right now. On the passageway to the waiting room, his eyes slid to the sign indicating security control. He felt his anxiety rising, panic overwhelming him. However, he knew that if he could get through that barrier in time, everything would be finally resolved. Thoughts raced through his mind that he couldn't make sense of. How did I get to this point? What will happen to her? How will I live with this? As they approached the security checkpoint, he felt his body tense up again. The security guards didn't inspire any confidence in him. His eyes darted from one guard to another, and he felt like they might notice something suspicious in his behavior. He began to pack quickly, but his movements were clumsy, almost jumbled. He tried to remain nonchalant, but his emotions raged inside him. His mother smiled weakly, noticing his nervousness, but she herself remained calm, almost impassive. "Are you worried?" she asked, looking at him with warm concern. It was like a punch to his stomach. He was ready to cry, but held back. All his efforts lost meaning in that moment. It was impossible to explain. She didn't know what was really going on, didn't see his inner world shattering. "No, just getting a little tired," he lied, even though he knew he wasn't. Everything inside him was splintering. They went through security and it seemed like all his worries were behind him. He slipped through the line, following her, and had little sense of the reality around him anymore. His mother was as calm as ever and prepared for this journey, unaware of the consequences. When they were in the waiting room, he felt his blood pressure drop. There was still one step left. One final step. He looked at his mother, sitting with a smile on her face, and his heart squeezed. His mother, his whole life, his unconditional love, sat next to him, and he was ready to leave her in a foreign place, among a crowd of strangers. He didn't know how to live with it. Some time passed, and the moment of boarding approached. He stood up, and clutching his suitcase, headed for the boarding gate, following his mother. His hand trembled slightly as he held out his boarding pass at the entrance of the plane. His face seemed to be completely calm, but his heart was pounding like crazy. "Mom, we'll be flying soon," he said, but his voice was devoid of liveliness, it sounded mechanical. She looked up at him and, in spite of her lostness, glowed. "Yes, I'm very glad," she replied, and he felt her words tear at his heart. Everyone around him moved as if they were not part of this tragedy. But inside him, everything was shattered. He walked her to the plane, not knowing what awaited them both. There was emptiness and despair inside him, but looking at her face, he felt like he couldn't go back. They sat down in their seats and he helped her settle in. And while on the surface it was business as usual, in reality, this moment was fateful. In that moment he knew he could not justify himself. He didn't know what to do next, but his plan was complete. The plane took off into the misty sky, and with every minute they were moving away from home, the tension in his chest grew stronger. He sat next to his mother, who despite her amnesia was still a woman with so much life in her, so much love. But his life was drifting away from her with each passing moment, like an invisible line he couldn't erase. His mind was racked with anxiety. Every turn, every thought of this step made him doubt more and more the rightness of his action. He couldn't afford to deviate from the plan, but being in this strange airspace, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong. His mother was passionate about something, but he couldn't figure out what. She talked about simple things, about how excited she was about traveling, how interested she was in new places. But how could he be excited about that? How could he look calmly into her eyes, knowing that he might have left her in danger, betraying her trust? Everything echoed in his mind, fear, doubt, and irritation. In that moment, he felt his heart clench with an internal struggle. He had believed that this would help him, that he would finally be free of all this pressure, but now he wasn't sure. He was surrounded by people, but they all seemed alien, out of touch with his pain. The anxiety that filled him grew stronger by the hour, like lightning strikes in his head. After a few hours, when he could no longer sit still and his face froze in tension, he decided he had to do something. He got up, leaving his mother in her seat, and walked across the parlor. He didn't know what he was going to do, but it was important. Everything inside him said his choice was wrong, but it was too late to go back. As he walked back to his seat, his gaze fell on the ticket he had taken. The only one-way ticket. He suddenly realized that he hadn't thought through all the consequences. He didn't know what he would do when they landed. He could feel his life, his plans falling apart. He couldn't even fully understand what had pushed him to take this step, but now, in this moment, his soul was full of doubt and fear. At one point, his mother turned to him with a question, and his heart clenched again. She didn't understand what was happening, she couldn't grasp the gravity of the situation because her mind was too shattered. But her sincerity and simplicity made him feel even more guilty. She looked at him with hope, with love, and her every word, her every movement seemed to weaponize his soul. "You're glad we're flying, aren't you?" Her voice was quiet, almost naive. He only nodded, trying to hide his anxiety, but a fire was igniting in his soul. Everything he was doing seemed increasingly pointless to him. He began to think about what would happen to him if she didn't come back. He felt his heart sinking into a great abyss, and he could find no answer as to what to do now. When they landed, he didn't know how to act. The landing was like a moment of truth, a moment when not only his body but also his soul was threatened. He realized that this was just the beginning. His whole life, everything he had once considered important, now hung in the balance. Everything was in his hands, but those hands were full of fear and doubt. He didn't know what to expect from this new chapter of his life. They went through passport control, and all the while his thoughts were in worry. He felt something cracking inside. From the moment they landed, he realized that even if he wasn't going to leave her, he had already betrayed her anyway. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a choice he couldn't justify. And now he didn't know what he should do. After they passed the controls, he noticed his mother starting to feel more and more insecure. Perhaps she sensed that something was wrong. Perhaps something in his behavior gave away his intentions, his inner struggle. He realized that it was impossible to keep playing this game, that every move now had consequences, and those consequences would inevitably be devastating. But he did not know how to turn this wheel that he himself had set in motion. They approached the counter to pick up their luggage, and he met her gaze. There was something strange, almost painful in her eyes. She tried to focus, but her mind was far from reality. She looked at him again, and there was the same helplessness in her gaze that he had tried to ignore all these months. His mother asked something, but he couldn't answer. All he could do was distract her, take her things, and show her the way out. But even in this moment, when he thought that everything could be wrapped up, that his actions might not result in tragedy, one thing was clear to him: he didn't know what would happen next. As they walked out of the airport, the night air seemed as cold and restless as his very soul. There weren't many people around, just a few tourists, cab drivers and souvenir sellers. But he could feel this world around him becoming alien, cold and unforgiving. He squirmed, trying not to think about what he had done, but the thoughts continued to haunt him. His mother was looking at him with interest again, as if nothing had happened. "Where are we going?" she asked with a smile, her voice full of a childlike innocence that only tore him apart more. He knew her ignorance was deceptive. This wasn't a simple journey. It was a trap he had laid for himself, and now he was about to face what was imminent. "It's a surprise, Mom," he said, though his voice shook and he tried to hide his worry. He could feel his hands begin to sweat. He wasn't prepared for what was coming next. And the farther they drove, the more he felt the closing of this vice that he himself had created. But he couldn't back down. He realized there would be no turning back. The cab moved quickly through the city streets, and all he could see were the blurry lights reflected in the car's glass. Sounds were muffled, and it seemed as if the world around him had become distant and insignificant. He went over and over in his head what he needed to do when they got to the place. He had to leave her here, regain his freedom, and then find a way to justify himself to himself. But everything was turning over in his soul. He didn't know how to deal with this dark shadow that was growing inside him. When they arrived at the hotel, he felt a strange heaviness in his chest. He got out of the cab and headed for the front desk. His mother was still smiling, not realizing that this was the moment her life could change. She couldn't understand why he was feeling so tense. He tried to maintain a semblance of calm, but it was difficult. He could take a step back, stop, but there was only one thought in his mind: he needed to finish this, no matter how hard it was for him. "We'll rest soon, Mom," he said, lightly putting his arm around her as they entered the inn. But his words sounded hollow. He knew he couldn't give her rest. No matter how much time they spent here, his conscience would not allow him to forget what he had already done. When he returned to the room, he felt the air grow heavy. He closed the door, and only images flashed through his mind, images of his mother's face, her smile, her trust. He had been ready for this moment, but now he realized he hadn't been ready. He had never been ready for what he was doing. He had gone through it as if by inertia, but now, standing here in front of his own mother, he realized the enormity of his mistake. "You don't want to tell me anything, do you?" she asked, watching him. His heart skipped a beat again. She felt something strange, something even he couldn't hide. He wanted to say something, but his voice was gone, unable to utter a word. He just stood there, trying to hide his pain, and she watched him, not knowing what was happening. "Mom, his words were cut off halfway through. He didn't know how to continue. She looked at him, her face expressing concern, but she couldn't understand what was really going on in his soul. He left the room, leaving his mother alone. He realized that something was going to happen, but he didn't know how it would end. All he wanted was to regain control of his life. But as he walked down the hall, he suddenly realized that this situation was far more complicated than he could have imagined. When he returned to the room, his eyes met his mother's. And in that moment, something in her gaze, her nonverbal gesture, made him feel that she understood everything. Not by words, not by actions, but by something hidden in her, that strange, blank stare. "Are you going to tell me everything?" Her question sounded soft, almost unintelligible, but he felt the question penetrate his soul, making him doubt himself. He couldn't quite put his finger on what was happening. But now it was clear to him, there was no turning back. He stood in front of her, feeling his body grow heavy with guilt, with fear. She was looking at him, and it was clear to him that all he could do was admit his mistake. But he didn't know how to do that. Several hours passed. Carlos could find no peace. He sat in his chair or went out on the balcony, trying to get rid of the excitement that overwhelmed him. Evening was slowly descending, and the whole city seemed absorbed in inactivity. But there was a storm brewing in his soul. He believed that he could regain control, that maybe things could still be fixed if he made the most out of this situation. But the more time he spent in the shadow of those thoughts, the clearer it became that he couldn't really break free anymore. His mother sat on the bed, absorbed in her thoughts. She was still innocent, her mind unable to grasp the whole truth, and it was agonizing for Carlos. She asked questions he couldn't answer. Her look, her voice, it all reminded him how deeply he had betrayed her. He had hoped that while they were here, in this hotel, he would be able to dispel his doubts and do things the way he had planned. But it wasn't working out for him. At some point he realized that he had to do something. He couldn't just sit in this hotel room and wait. He got up again and went out, determined to find the answer to his questions. Outside everything was quiet, it was late evening. He walked through the deserted streets with not a single soul in sight. It seemed to him that he was long lost, not only physically but mentally as well. How could he trust himself with such cruelty? He returned to the room, feeling exhausted. His mother was still sitting in her chair the same way. But when she saw him, something in her eyes changed. It was like a silent warning, as if she sensed something was wrong. Her eyes, filled with concern, met his. She said slowly, "Carlos, you're hiding something, aren't you?" Those words were like a knife that stabbed deeply into his chest. He felt his mind lose everything he was trying to hold on to. What was the truth? Everything he had tried to hide until now was now shattering. She knew something was wrong with her, but she couldn't quite figure out what it was. "Mom, he fell silent. He didn't know what to say, what to justify." She slowly got up from her chair and walked over to him. Her weak hand rested on his shoulder and she looked into his eyes as if trying to find an answer. "What's wrong with us, Carlos?" Her voice was full of pain. She couldn't understand, but there was fear in her eyes, a realization that whatever was happening wasn't simple. Carlos felt his chest tighten. He couldn't hide the truth any longer. "You can't remember everything," he said, trying not to give in to tears. "You can't understand why I did it. But it wasn't that easy, Mom. You couldn't possibly understand." Her eyes darkened for a moment, but she remained silent. He looked at her, realizing that now she saw that he was not only a traitor, but a man who had lost himself. The mother took a step back, as if trying to realize what she had heard. There was no anger in her eyes. There was something deeper, more tragic. She realized that everything she had done for him was on the brink of destruction. Carlos felt his soul being torn apart. He realized he couldn't escape what had happened. He had left her, and now that he was by her side, he could no longer ignore his guilt. "I just wanted things to get better," he said with a tremor in his voice. "I thought it would be easier. But it wasn't. You didn't deserve this." Tears began to roll down his face, and he felt his shoulders stiffen. Everything he'd been hiding was coming out. All those lies, all that plan that had seemed to be his salvation was now his undoing. He could no longer hide the truth. He had betrayed her, and that betrayal was destroying himself. His mother did not say a word, but her gaze was full of pain and regret. She couldn't understand everything he had been through, but she could feel her son losing himself. Carlos fell to his knees in front of her with his head down. He was ready to admit his mistake, ready to give everything he had just to get things back to normal. But he knew he couldn't. Time was slipping away, and he couldn't take back that moment when he became who he was now. His mother slowly sat down next to him and held out her hand. She didn't say a word, but her presence was his punishment, her forgiveness his only salvation. In that moment, Carlos realized that he himself had become someone in need of forgiveness. And perhaps it was the only thing that could save him. His mother, sitting beside him, didn't say a word, but her silence was more painful to Carlos than any rebuke. He sat on his knees, his body stiff from not being able to stand up, unable to look her in the eyes. She looked at him, her gaze full of compassion and pain, but worst of all, Carlos knew it was forgiveness, forgiveness he didn't deserve. The silence between them stretched endlessly. He could feel his inner world crumbling, the walls of the fortress he had built beginning to crumble. Now, as he stood on the edge of the abyss, he realized that he had been wrong, that he had chosen the wrong path. He had left her, his mother, at the airport. He had betrayed her for what? For his own gain, for the mirage of a better life. She said nothing, but his soul screamed with guilt. He couldn't believe he'd gotten to the point where he was willing to sacrifice her life for his own ambitions. He realized that his decision, this monstrous act that seemed like the only way out, was not only an act of betrayal, but also an act of self-destruction. At some point, the mother seemed to realize that her son had destroyed himself, not just her. She reached out and, without saying a word, gently stroked his shoulder. It was a gesture that needed no words. He felt her warmth, her support, despite all the horrible things he'd done to her. "Mom, I'm sorry," he said, unable to hold back the tears any longer. "I was so wrong. I thought I was doing the right thing. But I lost myself." "Lost you?" Her hand froze on his shoulders. She didn't try to comfort him with words because she knew he had to walk this path himself. The simple gesture, her silent presence spoke more than anything anyone could say. She understood that he needed this confession, and that it was up to him to accept the consequences of his actions. She knew he was finding the strength to change everything he'd destroyed, but it would be a long and difficult road. "You're not alone," she said quietly when he was able to calm down a little. Those words were the rock Carlos had been searching for so long. He knew he couldn't immediately get back everything he'd lost, but he also knew that if his mother was willing to forgive him, there was still something he could do to atone for his mistakes. Reconciliation didn't come all at once, and there was no magic moment when everything immediately fell into place. But step by step, day by day, he began to regain his humanity. He stayed by her side, helped her despite her illnesses and weaknesses, and began to see that there were things in life that were far more important than money and independence. He began to realize that his life was not lost, that as long as his mother was around, there was a chance for recovery. Carlos began to work on himself. He was no longer trying to run from reality. He was willing to accept whatever came his way and do his best to fix at least some of what he had destroyed. He decided to get help, start therapy, and rebuild his relationship with his mother. He had to go through a lot of hard conversations and confessions. He went through the feelings of alienation and rejection that accompanied him along the way, but he didn't back down. He began to realize that redemption was not just forgiveness, but a daily work on himself. It wasn't a quick process, but he increasingly felt the strength and light returning inside him. A few months later, after much reflection and work on himself, Carlos began volunteering, helping people suffering from loneliness and illness, realizing that caring for others could give him back his peace and tranquility. He continued to care for his mother, talking to her often, discussing her experiences and feelings, and their relationship grew stronger and stronger. One evening as they sat together in silence, she looked up at him, and her gaze was again full of love and understanding. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. Those words were like a revelation to Carlos. He realized that despite everything, he hadn't lost her love yet, and that she was still there to support him in his most difficult moments, just as she had been before. And although the road to redemption was long and full of trials, Carlos knew that it was only the beginning. And now that he was on that path, he was ready to go all the way. He believed that despite all his mistakes, he had a chance to make his life right. This path would not be easy, but he was no longer afraid to walk it. A long-awaited meeting with himself was ahead, and he knew that he now had the strength to go through with it. Months passed and Carlos' life continued to change. He learned to be patient and attentive to his mother. He no longer saw her illness as a heavy burden. Each day with her brought him lessons, and although they were full of fear and doubt, in her presence he felt a peace he had not known before. He continued to work on himself. He saw a therapist and talked to other people who were going through similar feelings of guilt and fear, and it helped him realize that he was not alone in his experiences. His relationship with his mother became deeper, more frank. Carlos learned to be not only a son with her, but also a friend, supporting and understanding her in her moments of weakness. But despite all these changes, something in his life remained unresolved. He couldn't forget how he had once left her. Those memories came back to him when he experienced moments of weakness. Sometimes when he watched her looking out the window or sitting in her chair, he felt the cold guilt fill his heart again. But he no longer tried to run away from that feeling. He accepted it as part of himself, part of his journey to redemption. One day, after another therapy session, he realized it was time to move on. Carlos decided he would no longer sit in the shadows of his past. He contacted an attorney and began to deal with the legal ramifications of what he had done. He realized there was a long road ahead, but he was no longer intimidated by the prospect of facing hardship. He was ready to take responsibility for his mistakes and do his best to make up for what he could. This decision was perhaps one of the hardest of his life. He didn't know what was in store for him, but he was sure it was necessary. He couldn't continue to live in fear of the future, of what might happen if he didn't take responsibility. He was willing to live through the consequences. In the end, when all the legal issues were resolved, Carlos was relieved. He didn't know if the punishment would be fair or not, but he no longer felt sheltered from the truth. He knew that all he had to do was admit his mistakes and try to turn his life around. Everything else didn't matter anymore. One night, while sitting at dinner with his mother, Carlos noticed her looking at him. Her eyes were full of pride and love. He realized that she, despite everything that had happened, was proud of him. And that was far more valuable than any possible apology. He knew that despite his mistakes, he was able to regain her trust. "You've become different, Carlos," she said, her voice soft but with true pride in it. "I always believed you would find your way." Those words were an acknowledgement of his strength. He was no longer the man who had once left her alone. He had become a man who sought forgiveness, who looked for ways to restore lost connections, and now his path was directed toward a future full of hope. Carlos knew his journey was just beginning. Everything he had endured, his mistakes, his pain and suffering, was just the beginning. He knew there were more challenges ahead, but now, with a new outlook on life, with confidence and with the love he was receiving from his mother, he was ready to go through anything. "You are still my son," she said, and those words became the most important thing in the world to him. With that love, he knew he could overcome any hardship because he was now a man capable of love and forgiveness. In that moment, he realized that his journey was not over. It was just beginning. As the months passed, Carlos continued on his path, which was not always easy, but with each step he became more confident in himself and in the fact that his life could change. The time he spent with his mother became not only a time of caring for her, but also a time of deep inner work for him. He couldn't just carry on as before, he strived to be a better son, a better man, and every day gave him the opportunity to experience what it meant to be who he was meant to be. He made the decision not to stop there. Realizing that real redemption was impossible without action, he began to look for ways to make his life more useful to others. He turned to several social projects that helped the elderly and those going through hard times. Working with such people became a real therapy for Carlos. He learned not only how to give, but also how to receive. He was honest with himself and those around him. Each day he became more and more aware that his life was in his hands. He continued to work on himself, spend time with his mother, and look for new ways to fulfill himself. But another important decision was something he realized: he needed to get back to life after all, and not only work on himself, but start breaking new ground. He decided to return to a job that once brought him joy, but which he had abandoned after his life took a wrong turn. He went back into business, but now with a new goal: not to make money for money's sake, but to create something that could actually do some good. Carlos began working on creating a program for seniors that would help them find new hobbies, as well as support them through difficult times in their lives. He realized that his mistake could not be undone, but with each such step he felt that he was coming back into this world as a person who might have a chance to make a difference. Despite all the difficulties and inner turmoil, Carlos learned to let go of fear and doubt. He was no longer afraid to face his mistakes. He began to realize that redemption is not only about forgiveness, but also about responsibility. Responsibility to those you love, to those who need you. One day, at one of their usual evening dinners, as he and his mother sat around the table discussing another day, she seemed to sense that the time had come for one last important conversation. She looked up and said quietly, "You're back, Carlos. You're back in your life. And I'm proud of it." Those words, spoken calmly, without emotion, but full of love and acceptance, were a true gift to him. He knew it was a confession that required no words. His mother was finally able to let him go, and he was able to let go of his guilt. Carlos continued to work on projects and help people without forgetting his family. He realized that the path he had chosen was long and thorny, but it was the path that was the only right one for him. He didn't look for easy solutions, he didn't wait for things to go back to the way they were. Instead, he kept taking steps forward, truly believing that his life could be worthy of being a part of it. Every day his relationship with his mother grew stronger. She remained a pillar of support for him, and he for her. Together they walked this road of recovery, and Carlos knew that despite the trials, despite his past mistake, he had become the man he was always meant to be. A man capable of forgiveness and love. More than a year had passed, and Carlos felt his life taking on new meaning. The time he spent with his mother became not just a time of caring, but a time of deep reflection and acceptance. He no longer tried to run from his guilt and fear, but learned to live with it, to use his mistakes as fuel for change. His life became not a struggle with the past, but a step into a future where every action was about regaining his dignity. Carlos didn't seek a quick forgiveness because he knew that true redemption was impossible without change. He couldn't erase his mistake, but he could build his life anew, reaffirming every day that his intentions were pure. He began to respect himself, to accept his vulnerability and strength. He no longer tried to run away from difficulties, but began to face them with an open heart. The project he was working on continued to grow. He began to see results. The people he was helping felt their lives were becoming more fulfilled, and for Carlos, that was the most important thing. He was creating a place where people could find their value despite their weaknesses and shortcomings. And perhaps that was his most important goal, to find ways to support those who felt lost, just as he himself had once done. His mother, though suffering from her illness, continued to be his source of inspiration. She, despite her amnesia, remained a woman with an inner light that sometimes flashed brightly in her eyes. She could not understand the depth of his experiences, but she always supported him. She was the person who taught him the value of love and forgiveness. Then one day, sitting in the silence of their home, Carlos looked at his mother. She was old and tired, her hands could no longer do what they used to, but there was still a warmth in her eyes that warmed him. He realized that life didn't last forever, and that every moment they spent together became precious. "Mom," he said, his voice full of tenderness, "I love you. And I can never thank you enough for giving me a chance to be a better person." She looked up at him, her gaze full of love and hardness. And in that moment, Carlos felt like he was finally the man he wanted to be. A man who could forgive himself, love and accept. He realized that redemption is not an end goal, but a journey. It is a journey that never ends. Redemption is not about undoing mistakes, but about how you change, how you learn to love and forgive, how you take responsibility for your life and try to make the world around you a little better. The road to redemption is one where you learn to be honest with yourself and others, and only by going through it can you truly understand what it means to live with an open heart. Carlos was ready for the future. He didn't know what it would bring him, but he knew one thing: he was now ready to face each new day with love and gratitude, because despite his mistakes, he was a man again. A man who could not only forgive, but also create a future. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked the story, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Your feedback is very important to me. I'm always happy to hear your opinion and find out what you liked or what could be improved. I apologize for any errors in the text. I use the system to voice the content, and although I try to make everything as good as possible, sometimes it can lead to small errors, as I have not yet perfectly mastered all the nuances of the language. Thank you for your understanding and support.